So this is going to be a rather odd video. We're going to be talking about tobacco, but we're going to be talking about one of the most important aspects of tobacco, and the reason that this video is being done, it's kind of an introduction to the N.E.T reviews that are going to be kicking off. I thought they were going to be done this week, but there's too much stuff going on here at the studio right now. They're going to be kicking off next week, and the idea is, what I'm going to be doing is essentially talking about tobacco curing. So I was going through the N.E.Ts that I've got in for review from the folks at Simply Leaf / the Juice Cabin and the folks over at Drake's. Now, there's about 20-ish, something like that, 20 odd N.E.T liquids that are going to be up for review, kicking off next week, and it's going to be going through into probably April-ish. I'm going to be doing 1 or 2 a week from each of the companies. And I would think, like, you get flu cured, which is my personal favourite. But then you've got the other ones, like you've got the other ones that are slower cured, the fermentation process curing. And I was thinking to myself, hold on, Vic, hold on. If you need to talk about the curing process for each and every one of these tobaccos or N.E.Ts that you're going to be reviewing, it's only one juice in each of the reviews, but if I'm going to have to talk about the curing process in every single one of the reviews, it's going to be like, what, fucking 15, 20 minute long review. And I thought, you know what? I'm doing this video as an intro to the N.E.T reviews that are kicking off next week. And what I'm going to do in the actual review, I'm going to mention the curing process and then cut it there and reference people back to this video so they can hear all about the different curing processes of tobacco. So tobacco leaf, doesn't matter what kind of tobacco leaf it is, tobacco leaves are filled with chlorophyll. It's the green stuff that makes leaves green. There's a plant there. There. It's not fake bio, it's actually a real plant. I got the ones that you don't need to water as much, because I've got a nasty tendency of forgetting to water fucking plants and they die on you. But yeah, the green stuff, it makes leaves green. So the entire point of curing tobacco leaves is, number one, to kill off the chlorophyll, because that's essentially what you're doing, you're killing the leaf. But number two, what you're trying to do with the curing process is not only kill off the chlorophyll that's actually in the plant, you're trying to do one of two things. Number one, you're trying to raise the sugar level of the plant. Or number two, you're trying to lower the sugar level of the plant. Because as chlorophyll dies, it partially ferments, very, very partially ferments. And that process usually involves the making of alcohol, which immediately disappears, and the production of sugar. Now, if you get a tobacco leaf and you start curing it, generally speaking, and this is an overgeneralization, the longer you cure that leaf, the less nicotine you're going to have and the more sweetness you're going to have, depending on the curing process. And there's 4 different types of curing process when it comes to curing tobacco leaf. You've got the age-old standard, air cured, which usually takes 4 to 8 weeks. You end up with a tobacco leaf at the end of the process that's low in sugar content but very high in nicotine content. And all that basically happens is the leaves are hung up in a big airy barn. That's it. They're strung up on poles, stem up, leaf down, and they're hung up to essentially dry in a big, airy, well-ventilated barn for anywhere between 1 month to 2 months. And that kind of slow air curing process is normally reserved for the outer wrap or the inner outer wrap that you get in rather expensive tobaccos. So your cigar wrapper or the inner wrapper that's underneath the outer wrapper of the cigar, not the filler, the wrapper of the cigar, or your Kentucky Burley style tobacco, that deeper, richer tone that's got a slight, actually there's some Burley tobaccos that are up for review, but it's got a slight acidic content, well not content, slight acidic flavour to it with a tiny touch of a kind of spicy back note. That's what happens when you get an air-cured tobacco. It's a much more longer process than the general flue curing that we're going to talk about later on, but that's what air curing is all about. The second most regular style of curing tobacco is the fire-cured tobacco. Now, fire-curing tobaccos generally takes 3 days, yeah, as short as 3 days, for an extremely quick curing process, or 5 weeks. And generally what tends to happen is the leaf is once again strung up, leaf down, stem up, onto a long pole. And hardwood, and it's usually hardwoods, are left to smoulder somewhere in that general vicinity of where those leaves are hanging. They're generally not directly below the leaf unless the leaves are very high up on the rack. And what tends to happen is, because of the heat that's being produced from the smouldering hardwood, the leaf dries out a lot quicker than if it was actually air cured. Now, for the longer processes of fire curing tobacco, what generally tends to happen is the leaf is hung up much higher up. There's more air introduced into the actual fire curing barn, so the temperature's lowered down, but more importantly, more smoke from that fire is introduced into the leaf. This is why when you smoke, or for that matter vape, a full fire-cured N.E.T tobacco, there's one thing that you're going to pick up on. There's a kind of smoky flavour to it, like a kind of wood smoke, that kind of odd smell that you get from hardwood wood smoke, but you get that in the flavour. A kind of smokiness. It's like smoked mackerel, smoked haddock, like true traditional smoked haddock that's hung up with hardwood fire underneath it. That kind of flavour, you actually get that in the tobacco, and that's coming not from the tobacco itself. It's coming from the tobacco leaf. As the chlorophyll is dying off, the leaf is sucking in the wood smoke and locking it into the leaf. Now, generally speaking, for this kind of fire-cured tobacco, you will generally get, again, low sugar, but much more higher net content, which is why pipe tobacco and dark tobacco, like really dark tobacco, like drum, it's a classic example. Old Holborn, if you can still get Old Holborn these days, but drum, Old Holborn that's got that darker strand going through it, that's been fire-cured. You can instantly tell it's been fire-cured by the flavour that comes from the actual tobacco. So pipe tobacco, dark tobacco, chewing tobacco and snuff, they generally tend to be fire-cured tobaccos, generally speaking. Now we get on to my personal favourite. I haven't had enough coffee. It's like 9:30 in the fucking morning or something that I'm recording this. Hold on. I've only had one coffee so far. Let's have a vape first. Now we're on to my personal favourite, flue-cured tobacco. So flue curing is the same as fire curing, but there's one major difference. Instead of the smoke from the wood being introduced to the tobacco leaf, so the tobacco leaf, as the chlorophyll dies off, it sucks in the it sucks in the wood smoke. The smoke is taken out of the equation. So what generally happens with flue curing tobacco is the heat from the burning or smouldering hardwood is put in some kind of, call it fireplace, right? Call it fireplace. There's a flue that removes the smoke, but there's a secondary flue that transfers a lot of the heat rising up underneath the flooring of the barn. So the heat rises, but the smoke is not allowed to interact with the leaf. Now you get the same quick air curing process that you would expect from a fire-cured tobacco, but you get none of the smoke being absorbed by the actual leaf. Flue-cured tobacco generally tends to be Virginia. It generally tends to be Virginia. Bright leaf Virginia, medium leaf Virginia, or the rare occasion dark leaf Virginia. Not that there isn't really a lot of dark leaf Virginia genuses out there right now. It's all basically bright leaf. But basically, if you light a cigarette, odds are that tobacco has been flue cured. The reason it's been flue cured is because the flue curing process only takes, at a maximum, 1 week. It's a very, very, very quick turnover for the flue curing process. However, with that 1 week comes an additional problem. That leaf is high in sugar, but it's relatively medium to low in nicotine content, because here's the problem, and it's a big problem that you've got to look out for if you're curing a tobacco leaf. The higher the heat, the more nic degrades. Nicotine, like the chlorophyll, the green shit that's in the plant, oxidizes at higher temperatures. The higher you bump up that temperature, the quicker the oxidization process happens to kill off the chlorophyll, but the problem is you're also killing off the nicotine, which is why bright leaf Virginia flue cured tobaccos generally tends to have much less nicotine content than the slower fire curing process and the much more slower air curing process. This is why with the bright leaf Virginia tobaccos that you generally tend to get in modern cigarettes these days, nicotine's actually sprayed on to the leaf in post-process, along with about fucking 2,000 other chemicals, but generally that's what tends to happen. There's more nicotine, raw nicotine, usually freebase, that's sprayed onto the leaf just before that leaf is shredded to be included in your cigarette. The flue cure process is much faster, which is why it's the much more preferred means of curing a tobacco leaf, because it's a much more quicker turnover. But with that quicker turnover, you're killing off a lot of the nicotine content. A lot of the nicotine content, which they've got to make up for by spraying more nicotine onto the leaf. I know, it's fucking nuts. I mean, why don't they just do a shorter cure fire process? Instead of the usual 3, 4 or 5 weeks for fire curing, do a fire cure for 2.5 weeks or 2 weeks. Okay, you'll end up with a slightly bitter, because again, fire curing, you're lowering the sugar content. You'll end up with a slightly bitter tobacco flavour, but you'll have more nic in there. But no, they go for fucking flue cure. Anyway, that is the three, that's the three major means of main curing a tobacco leaf. But there's other ways, 2 other ways that we don't generally tend to see unless you are a cigar aficionado or you're an aficionado of rarer tobaccos. Sun curing. Now this only happens, believe it or not, in sunny climates. It's not going to fucking happen in Scotland, that's for sure. Sun curing. Iraq, which used to be one of the biggest producers of sun-cured tobacco leaf. For obvious reasons, it's not anymore, but India is another place that you generally tend to get sun-cured tobacco. Some regions of China still do sun-curing of tobacco, and instead of the tobacco being hung up, stem up, leaf down, it's laid out flat on something. It's usually a bit of tarpaulin or something like that to keep the leaf clean, and it's laid out in the sun for anywhere from 3 to 5 days. Again, it's less than a week, because in these hotter climates, especially if you put out a tobacco leaf in direct sunlight, you're basically flue curing it without the flue. It's basically what you're doing. But you've got the added benefit of having direct sunlight interacting with the chlorophyll in that leaf. So not only are you oxidizing it, you're also having a lot of ultraviolet rays direct from the sun interacting. Shut up. Right, that was this fucking tablet thing going off. But you're also having direct ultraviolet rays interacting with the dying chlorophyll. So with sun curing, unlike flue curing, which is high in sugar but low in nic, sun curing is high in both. It's high in nic and also high in sugar. The problem with sun curing is the aftertaste. This is why you generally don't tend to get sun-cured tobaccos in a normal cigarette. You generally tend to get sun-cured tobaccos in higher-end pipe tobacco or medium to higher-end cigars. It's like a spicy tone. And if you haven't tried a sun-cured tobacco, you won't have a fucking clue what I'm talking about. But there's a very definite spicy tone, like a kind of clove-esque type flavour, with a little bit of more spice added on. It's from the curing process, essentially. from the curing process, the direct sunlight is essentially killing off what's remaining of the chlorophyll, but because the chlorophyll is not being heated up as long or as much as the fire cure or flue cure process, and because there's no wood smoke being sucked in by the leaf to preserve what's left of the chlorophyll is essentially dying off a lot quicker. High sugar content, high nic content. With the higher sugar content in direct sunlight, that chlorophyll is also partially fermenting, and that partial fermenting process gives you a kind of spicy flavour. Perique. It's one of the ones that spring to mind immediately when it comes to a sun-cured tobacco leaf. If you've tried a Perique-style tobacco, you'll know what I'm talking about. It tastes like a Virginia, but there's that odd aftertaste that's kind of spicy and lingers for a very, very long time. Speaking of Perique, you've got two types. This is the last style of curing, which is very, very rare these days. Fermentation. Yeah, you can actually ferment tobacco leaves. Well, it's actually very easy to ferment tobacco leaves, and generally what tends to happen for the more rarer styles of tobacco, like your Periques, that kind of idea, is the general short process of a flue cured tobacco is done, but it's stopped halfway through. So some of that chlorophyll, but not a lot, some of it is left inside. Then all the leaves are stacked, tied up, put in a bath of sugar, water, not actual sugar, but sugar water, and then it's squished with a big heavy weight to get rid of all the air inside the leaf. And what happens is that sugar interacts with what remains of the chlorophyll inside the actual tobacco leaf. The tobacco leaves begin to ferment, and the curing process is finished. At the end of that, you get a very odd flavour. It's like a Perique, but with added sweetness, and you've got the back end of some kind of, again, it's another spicy flavour, but it's not as spicy as the likes of your sun-cured. And again, there's actually some fermentation process leaves that I think it's Drake's. I don't think it's simply leaf. I think one of the Drake ones is one of the Perique variants. It's a very, very unusual flavour. It's a very unusual flavour, but for the most part, if you're going to be dipping your toe into the whole naturally extracted tobacco e-liquid, you're probably going to be vaping on a liquid where the extraction has been taken from a flue-cured bright leaf Virginia. Because odds are what you'll end up buying is going to be some kind of Virginia-based tobacco extracted liquid. That's probably what you're going to end up getting, unless you purposefully go for something like St. John's Perique, those deeper, richer, darker toned tobaccos, either that's been fermented or sun-cured. Depends what you want to do. I mean, you're going to be hearing the flavour profiles and what the actual tobacco tastes like when we get further into the review. But the reason that I've done this kind of introduction to the N.E.T reviews kicking off next week is I'm going to be talking a lot about the actual curing process of the tobacco. I'm just going to mention it essentially. I'm going to be mentioning what the curing process for that particular tobacco was before the actual review kicks off and I start vaping it. That way you're going to have a fair idea what the flavour profile could possibly be when I do start vaping. Anyway, I think that basically wraps that up. So yeah, have a good one.